Hi there, this is Jonathan, the editor at Conter and the presenter of this ConterCast, episode 1. It was a podcast slash radio show that we kind of put together on Monday over at Sunny Govan Community Radio, who very kindly donated their sort of studio for us to use for hopefully what is going to be a sort of regular periodic thing for the site. Before we kind of get into this debate, this is just a quick thing to apologise for the first sort of 10-11 minutes of the audio. We had a sort of mic issue in the studio which we didn't realise at the time, but we sort of rectified as the debate went on. So stick with it. Thereafter it does kind of improve markedly the quality of the audio. But yeah, just another wee apology that, teething problems. It was our first podcast that we put together. But we hope you like how it turned out. If you're interested in listening to more of these in the future, please get involved in the site, give us feedback on the Twitter or the Facebook, or email me at editor@conto.co.uk with any ideas you might have. On with the podcast. Hello, you're listening to 103.5, that's Sunny Govan Community Radio. I'm Jonathan Rimmer, and this is ConterCast, which is a new periodic debate show that we're going to be sort of broadcasting as and when, probably about, we hope once a month, but this is a bit of a try run today, so bear with us any sort of technical hitches or anything like that. I'm joined today by two guests who are going to be, I suppose, informally debating, not super confrontationally or anything like that. But I have journalist David Jamieson, and I have Laura Dover, who is a Labour campaigner and activist. Would you like to introduce yourself first of all, David? What you do, things like that?
I'm a journalist at Day Jobs in Common Space. I write here and there as well, as all journalists do these days. And I'm on the editorial board of Conter as well.
And Laura, could you introduce yourself just quickly as well?
Yeah, so I work in the third sector and I'm a Scottish Labour activist, a member of Scottish Labour Campaign for Socialism, and I was a candidate in Kilmarnock and Loudon in the 2017 general election.
Fantastic. Just for folk who are listening who don't know what Conter is a cross-party site for Scottish Socialists. We launched, it would have been last year, so probably around about October. And basically we've had contributors from across the political spectrum, all on the left we should say, we don't accommodate Tories, but so activists with Labour, the SNP, SSP, RISE, the Scottish Greens, and sort of journalists and activists and people who aren't really affiliated to anybody in particular. ConterCast, I suppose, we intend this to be the first of many kind of debates where we actually get people discussing these big issues on an amicable basis, because we're all sort of on the same side. But I suppose listeners will know all too well that Scottish left is not the most unified presence at all times. I'm sure anybody who's campaigned or knocked on doors of any political party will know it can be quite bitter at times, even between people who ostensibly believe much of the same thing. So I suppose we hope a debate show like this could be something that is quite positive and quite constructive. We want people to engage with what we're saying, but sort of reflect on sort of what common ground we have with sort of our political, not rivals, but people who we disagree with politically. And if we are serious about advancing a socialist project in Scotland, what is that going to look like? Which kind of brings us on to the theme of today's debate. We're going to be kind of looking at whether Labour is the right vehicle through which to develop a socialist project, because obviously Scotland, we're in a different situation to the rest of the UK in that a significant portion of the left voted yes to independence in 2014. But obviously since Jeremy Corbyn's election in 2015, there's been a huge swell in the ranks of Labour, not just south of the border, but also north of the border to some extent as well. So we want to look at where we differ on this, where our common ground is, and how viable we think such a project is. We should say off the bat, so obviously Laura's obviously introduced herself as a Labour activist. David is pro-independence.
Absolutely.
So you're coming from slightly different sort of perspectives here, but you both want to see a socialist project succeed across the United Kingdom, I think it would be fair to say. So I suppose the first question I kind of want to ask, I kind of want to direct to Laura first, if that's okay. you're a member of Labour. You're an activist with Labour. Why is it that you believe Labour is the right place to be if you are a socialist? And why do you think sort of other folk on the left should consider joining in Scotland?
So I joined Labour back in 2013 under Ed Miliband in the kind of wilderness years, when things looked pretty bad. Basically because it was my assessment at the time that it was sort of the most fertile ground for transforming the party, and as a mass party also the best vehicle for transforming society. I think over the past 5 years that's basically been proven kind of broadly correct. Since 2015, when Corbyn was elected, it's presented the most sustained and serious socialist challenge in recent British history. I would encourage people to join regardless of what side they are on in the independence debate, to be honest, because it doesn't help develop the forces that we need to change society if people who are broadly supportive kind of want to sit on the sidelines of that movement rather than be a part of it from the inside. People don't have to drop all their doubts about the party. They don't have to think that Labour's great or that Scottish Labour's great or even that it's made up for its past. But there does have to be a recognition, I think, that Labour offers a genuine break now from neoliberalism, and a genuine opportunity for workers to gain control over the economy, and nowhere else electorally at the moment is offering that.
So, David, I suppose sparking on from that point Laura made there was that you don't want to be on the sidelines of a movement if they're kind of at the vanguard of such a socialist project across the UK, whether you're pro-independence or not.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a member of Labour. I don't think you've ever been a member of Labour, as far as I know. Why is it that you've not taken the plunge and sort of joined Labour despite the sort of change in orientation and politics of leadership over the past sort of couple of years?
I don't think I'd ever be in the Labour Party because I'm not a Labourite, and the politics of Labour goes beyond socialism. It's a certain view of how you change society. I mean, the ambition of both me and Laura here is to get beyond the capitalist system, the capitalist social order, and establish a more democratic, more egalitarian social order, socialism, a wholly new type of society. And for well over 100 years, going back about as far as the Labour movement has existed, there's always been a debate on the left about certain key theoretical problems in that project, the project of moving beyond capitalism to a new social order. One of the biggest ones, and the one that defined the 20th century, was the state. What orientations do socialists have on the state? Now, the Labourite orientation is classically, we use the state in its current composition to move beyond the sort of capitalist economy. And there's a difference there in the way socialists view the process of social change, in that I don't think that the state and the economy are two separate entities in Britain. I think they're two different parts, two different mechanisms of the same social order. So, that might seem like quite a kind of obscure theoretical issue, but I think it has sort of real world implications every day when you're a socialist activist. That said, I need to say, I want Jeremy Corbyn to be the next Prime Minister. I support Scottish independence without being a member of the Scottish National Party. I happen to support Brexit without being a member of UKIP. And for socialists, most of what happens in socialist politics always takes place outside of Parliament. Most of what we believe in, most of the activism we're involved in, takes place outside Parliament. So there's a legitimate debate to be had that Laura's raised about whether socialists should be in the party of Labour itself to be part of that movement. I think that we do have to remember that the socialist movement is fundamentally extra-parliamentary, and that the victories of Corbynism, or for that matter independence, will be fundamentally extra-parliamentary.
Mm-hmm. I suppose there's probably much of that you'd actually agree with Laura, straight off the bat, but I mean, just quickly before I sort of get on to the next point, I mean, is there anything you would say to that in terms of, I mean, as David says, in terms of activism, so much of it goes outside of our party political sphere. If you're someone listening to this who wants to make a difference and be a socialist, and wants Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, even, is it absolutely necessary that they join the Labour Party, or is there other ways you think that they can get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, and I think that obviously left-wing groups, pro-independence groups in Scotland will continue to exist outside the Labour Party. And for as long as that goes on, we should try and find ways to work together constructively on the things that we do agree on. I don't think that the characterisation of sort of the Labour road to socialism, if you put it that way, was completely fair there. I think people who came to Labour through Corbyn or who were pre-2015 members and voted Corbyn do believe that we can just sort of take hold of the British state and then use it to carry out piecemeal reforms. I think people understand that the point of a left-leaning Labour government is to create opportunities to apply pressure from below in an effective way. But I expect we'll come back to that later on.
Yeah, sure. I suppose, on that point as well, just you're talking about sort of Labour using the sort of British state to kind of transform the UK gradually through piecemeal reforms, as you were saying. If you're someone who, I suppose, voted Labour for many, many years, we're sat in Govan, obviously, which was an area that was very solidly Labour for many, many years. And obviously, recent history tells us that's no longer really the case. How can Labour, as a party and as a movement, speak to people who are wanting something more sort of, not just in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of they want something that is imminently radical and something that is really going to transform their communities in the immediate sense, especially people, I suppose, who feel detached from, who went on to vote yes, typically in 2014, and feel as if that the British state and that way of doing things is now in the past. It's not something that's worked. What would you say to folk listening who think that?
Well, I think the big step that we had to take to start to rebuild Labour in Scotland has been taken to some extent because we have had the major departure from New Labour now. It's happened down south pretty overwhelmingly, and it's happened here to a lesser extent, but it is still there with the election of Richard Leonard last year. I passed the Mary Barber statue just on my way in here this evening. Richard is proposing a Mary Barber law to bring in rent controls, which will have a pretty serious impact on the ability of private landlords to use tenants as cash cows. And he's proposing a sort of overall programme of democratising the economy and giving power back to workers and power back to communities. I think what we need to do is to be more consistent in that, because at the end of the day, Labour's a third party now, so it does have to sort of get over this approach that it takes of commenting on everything that happens, and it does need to focus on these sort of key message of housing, of workers' rights, and of control over the economy, because that's where it can win. I'm sure we'll come back to this later as well, but it really does need to solidify the position on the national question, and it needs to understand that it's not just sort of irrational, romantic nationalism for people to feel that they're governed by institutions which they are alienated from, which are geographically far away from in terms of social class. I think we've got to get a constitutional position that recognises that and kind of ties it up with the idea of rebalancing the economy and devolving the UK further. I think we've started to do that by adopting radical federalism, but it really hasn't been developed to any great extent, and I'd like to see us do that more. And finally, I do think it needs to embed itself more firmly in communities again. I think that when Labour was in power in Scotland, there was a perception that it was sort of concerned with high politics only and with dealing with civil society organisations and financial institutions. And I think that, again, made people feel like it wasn't interested in their day-to-day lives. And we have now got a community organising unit, and we've appointed some organisers in Scotland and across the UK. So I'm hoping that with that we'll start to see sort of campaigns that are embedded in communities and reflect people's concerns. Yeah, there is still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, David, do you think some of the stuff that Laura was talking about there, is that Labour going in the right direction? If I mean, I know you're not sort of from Govan locally, but if you were somebody listening from an area like this, would that be enough to sway you? Would you think, at least in a party political sense, though your activism, you know, you express in different ways in different places, would that be enough for you to get behind Labour in an election, say?
I mean, you know, let's not forget the left's decline in communities like Govan all over the UK. That's not just something that's happened to the Labour Party. The socialist movement in general has retreated from these areas. Some of those are self-inflicted wounds, and the left loves to talk about the things that's messed up. But some of those things are about huge changes as well, demographic changes, changes in the structure of the global economy, the successful campaign waged by Thatcher and subsequent Tory and Labour governments, new Labour governments, to dismantle working class solidarity, dismantle working class institutions. So it's not to sort of come from the standpoint of a kind of, you know, snobbery where it's like, well, this is all just Labour's fault or something. This is a general problem of the left here in Scotland, in the UK, across Europe, in much of the world, right? That said, I think that the points that Laura moved on to latterly are the most important ones, you know. I think I had this expectation almost as well, that I thought a populist leader, socialist leader like Jeremy Corbyn would come along, and a whole new generation, and to an extent some have, younger people in particular, have switched back on to high politics, like you say. We, as a movement, have to reckon with the fact that alienation, which has been bred for decades between working class people and high politics, that's going to take a very long time to repair. And the priority is building those institutions of working class people themselves in places like Govan. Like some of my favourite projects that the left's engaged in right now are things like Live and Rent, the Tenants Union, things like Better Than Zero, which is bringing young people into trade union activism. It's that kind of institutional basis that we need to rebuild. I would say that I felt Labour's missed a trick, and I know why it's happened, right? It's happened because from the moment Corbyn came in, there's been a non-stop faction fight. That was inevitable. Right? Corbyn's been under siege from day one. And I think that's why momentum, particularly down south, I have to say, because there's other problems in Scotland for Scottish Labour, but momentum down south had a choice between being an instrument of an internal faction fight or something that really, his remit was to take Labour out of high politics and into the streets and into the workplaces and stuff like that. And that's proved a difficult task, I accept, when that faction fight is ongoing. My worry, though, is that when your view of socialist transformation is always, well, it starts in government, that there will always be this gravitational pull. There'll always be this gravitational pull to shore up your faction in the Parliamentary Labour Party, to shore up your influence in the branches of the Labour Party, which has had spectacular growth. It's 500,000 people, but it's 500,000 people in a country of 65 million people. And I just worry sometimes that that's always going to be the kind of the direction of that pull. That said, and this is why I think it's important we think of the socialist movement as socialist inside large parties and socialists outside large parties, because let's not forget, in Scotland there are now several large electoral parties with socialists in them, which is a truly kind of historically incredible situation. But we therefore need a movement that goes well beyond parties. Parties will always be institutionally linked in a sense to the state, to the parliament, to various institutions like that. And to create a real mass movement, I think you need more than that. You need a broader movement than that.
I mean, you touched upon just there sort of folk in sort of factions of Labour feeling marginalised, and I suppose the battle that exists in the party, which kind of neatly leads on to the article that you wrote, sort of, Laura, from a sort of different angle. So you wrote an article called "Left Out: Socialists and the Independence Movement." And I don't want to talk too much about the SNP, but this idea, factionalism isn't just a thing that exists within Labour, obviously, in a very visible sense. it's something that's more publicly discussed. But you argue in that article that I suppose that socialists on the people on the pro-independence left, left-wingers within the SNP have felt sort of marginalised or been marginalised quite deliberately. We've seen this, with the Growth Commission and other things. I mean, if you're listening to this and you're someone who voted yes because you were genuinely caught up in what was an incredible moment for Scotland, an incredible social movement that developed within Scotland, and all the messaging we heard back then about a new kind of politics, all that kind of thing, is something that Jeremy Corbyn's very much brought forward. He's used a lot of the same sort of language there. I mean, what would you say is Labour's sort of prospectus? I mean, what's Labour offering this group specifically, I would say?
Well, off the top of my head, from our manifesto last year, I think we were offering a programme of 500,000 council houses across the UK, and I think that was specifically 100,000 in Scotland, a £10 an hour minimum wage by law, a Scottish investment bank with like £20 billion of spending power, which again kind of conveniently fits well with a sort of idea of radical federalism, where we devolve further power and further spending power to different parts of the UK and allow them a bit of control to build up industry. I think that it's also offering opportunities for struggle from below through the trade union movement and through tenants' unions like Live and Rent, campaigns like Better Than Zero. Obviously, we've got nationalised railways, nationalised utilities. I think David's right to say that we can't have a government without a sort of movement on the ground to bolster the government. But actually, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have both been pretty vocal that it's not just what happens in Parliament, and actually what happens in Parliament is a lot of the time not barely even consequential, far less important than that movement behind it. And it does concern me that what we've missed since 2015, despite the sort of influx of people to the Labour Party, those people sort of tend to turn out to vote in internal elections. So we keep the NEC, we keep the policy forums and things like that. We even get motions passed at annual conference. But there's no sort of backbone within people's workplaces, within people's communities, that is going to keep that government going through the really hard times that it will face if it ever gets to power from the financial institutions in the UK. And that's something that still needs to be built up.
I mean, David, we heard there sort of a raft of policies there from yourself, Laura, about what was in Labour's that manifesto last year. And I mean, we shouldn't obviously pretend that some people in Scotland weren't swung to that from people that voted yes. There certainly was a small number of people who that certainly did appeal to. But I mean, if you're on the sort of the left of the SNP movement, and your overriding goal in your head is independence, and then once we get to that point, we can kind of deal with all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Given Laura's sort of tone is very much sort of, we welcome pro-independence supporters, and considering Jeremy Corbyn has echoed so much of what, I suppose in rhetoric at least, the SNP seemed to be offering a few years ago, or 2015 election certainly, an anti-austerity message that cuts through with the greater population. If you're in the SNP and you're seeing sort of the way that party is going, arguably, in terms of now what the vision is going to be for independence, the Growth Commission and everything that stemmed from that, I mean, why would you stay in that party? I know you're not in the SNP yourself, but I mean, what would the argument be, do you think?
I think that the constitutional question has become one of elemental power. It does have a power. I mean, I don't think that can be get around. The thing is, I think that's partly about the past, about decades of neoliberalism and a total loss of belief in Westminster. That's not just restricted to Scotland, of course. That's UK-wide, that people don't trust Westminster. The difference in Scotland is you can frame it in the national question. And you can construct a strategic vision around that. So I think that's a major problem for Labour, and I do think it's a major problem for Labour that they struggle with a national question. I mean, I salute any attempt to develop the kind of radical federalism model that you get on parts of the Labour left. But I think people also intrinsically understand that there are major problems in the development of that. A couple are the fact that the UK is made up of several nations, one of which is much larger than the other three. The other three kind of units. There are others. I mean, there's no obvious sense in which devolution pushes us towards kind of any kind of economic radicalism. There's a well-tested formula across Europe of, devolving the axe, where there are so many layers of bureaucracy in the state, so many layers of governance, that it's difficult to pin blame for, say, austerity or economic liberalisation, or, and it's difficult to find a sufficient body of powers in any one of these layers to argue for radical change. So I think people intrinsically understand that there are problems with the development of that model. That said, at least there's some imagination on the Labour left in arguing for that, and on Labour right in Scotland, there's really none whatsoever. So I think that, I think that's a major issue. As for the SNP left, I mean, let's be honest, it has remained very amorphous. And I think if there had been a more strongly and firmly cohered SNP left, and there are plenty of socialists in the SNP. I remember there was that famous poll that found that UK-wide 26% of Labour members wanted to end, and the term was a bit strange, British capitalism. 40% of SNP members wanted to end British capitalism, whatever precisely that means. But it does show you the degree of left-wing feeling that's in the Scottish National Party. I can't help but feel, had that body drawn itself together into a more effective faction inside the SNP, we might not be looking at the Growth Commission. Now, it is good, though, that all of the SNP's national assemblies, all three of them, there has been quite significant resistance to large parts of the Growth Commission, particularly the currency model. If you know what the Growth Commission is, very quickly...
if we could just have a quick sort of explanation for listeners who might not be so aware of what that is.
The SNP commissioned a Growth Commission for what the economics of an independent Scotland would look like. Unfortunately, this was largely done through academic economists, but more importantly, business lobbyists who were pro-independence, and they returned a body of ideas which were things like sterlingisation, so Scotland would keep the pound without key economic levers that independent countries have over their currency. But in general, it very much reflected the economics that we've had for the last 10 years and since before the crisis, and which led to the crisis. So it's very much the model of liberal economics that's been in vogue in Britain for several decades, and in that, therefore, really didn't reflect the sorts of radicalism that you saw in the pro-independence movement and the Yes movement in sort of 2012 to 2014. But there's a really important part of this that has to be remembered, which is that not only did the SNP or the Growth Commission launched this on behalf of the SNP, the next day it was relaunched through Reform Scotland, which is another kind of centre-right think tank, by the SNP and Labour and I believe the Scottish Tories, sans some of the elements which refer specifically to independence, so without that strange currency idea. So what the Growth Commission represented is the reconsolidation of the right in Scottish politics, outside of the party structure, but leaning into the party structure. So 2012 to 2014, and then followed by that Corbynism, represented a real growth in left-wing thought in Scottish and British society, and this is the right basically trying to reassert itself. So you're absolutely right to say, there are factions in every single party. It's not just Labour, because the fight between the interests of ordinary working class people and the people who actually own and control society manifests in any major popular institution that comes into existence.
And bearing that in mind, Laura, in terms of, we were just saying there how there is clearly an appetite for an anti-capitalist, or at least a very broadly progressive project that could command support, not just across the UK, but across Scotland specifically. But, you know, these activists and supporters are distributed, for better or worse, across Labour, across the SNP, across various different parties and movements. And there's been something of a deadlock now for a while in terms of independence, whatever you know your views on Labour's other policies, is still the elephant in the room. And Scottish Labour's position has been so rigid on this. And although that, you know, Scottish Labour attacked the Growth Commission, or Richard Leonard obviously spoke about it in the strongest terms, what do you think Scottish Labour's position on independence itself, not just obviously the proposals put forward, but independence as a concept going forward?
Well, to start with what I think it shouldn't say, I think it needs to abandon the campaign line no to a second independence referendum. I mean, even just anecdotally from being out on the streets knocking doors in Kilmarnock last year, it was not a line that people were interested in. It was all that came from Scottish Labour HQ, and it didn't command support. It didn't command interest. What people wanted to know was what a Labour government would do to change their lives. And the constant sort of hammering home of the unionist position is clearly dead in the water. I think people who are really committed to unionism have found the party that will do that for them, and that's the Scottish Conservatives. And I don't think we should have any interest in trying to be the Scottish Conservatives. In terms of what it should say, I mean, I've gone into this a bit. I do think that we should pursue the radical federalism line, and I think it should be framed in terms of how we can to redistribute not just wealth but political power between different regions of the UK. I know that we've appointing a researcher on radical federalism, which is kind of an acknowledgement that we don't know quite what we're doing with this yet, but hopefully...
Can you quickly sort of define for listeners, as you see it? I know people have some different perspectives on this. Can you define what radical federalism means as you see it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it does mean a lot of things, a lot of different things to different people. Some people prefer to call it home rule. I think radical federalism is better because it's an acknowledgement of the fact that the alienation felt by Scottish people towards Westminster is not purely a sort of Scottish sentiment, that people across parts of England and parts of Wales, even Northern Ireland, which is a different issue altogether, also feel completely alienated from Westminster. And I mean, in David's article that he wrote, he talked about disrupting the British state, and actually federalism would be one way of doing that, because it would involve decentralisation of political power to different parts of the UK, so that people are governed broadly where they're from, that money is spent in local areas, and that political power is wielded, high-level political power is wielded, again, where people live rather than distantly.
Well, you did mention there, Laura, very kindly, David's article, because it's something we should bring up. For those who want to read it, it's on conter.co.uk. That's, probably should have said that at the start, really, shouldn't I? The link to the site, if people want to read sort of some of the commentary many of our contributors come out with. And if you ever want to pitch anything, of course, it's editor@conter.co.uk, and I do respond to everybody, so please do send stuff in. But David's article, the article you published or you wrote this week, basically, you as Laura was saying, it tackled primarily with the crisis of the British state as you see it, and what how socialists should essentially tailor their analysis around that and around the state. I mean, I suppose I want you to kind of touch briefly on what you mean by that. Obviously, Laura said there herself, kind of her perspective on it. But I suppose more specifically as well for this discussion, I mean, you talked about Labourism, I suppose, as you see it. You touched on that at the very start of the programme as well, and how it's concerned with, I suppose, stewarding and recalibrating the British state into sort of working people's interests, but, you know, very much still maintaining that sort of system that is embedded. And you did sort of articulate, you know, that Corbynism is a slight departure from that. That's not fully what that represents. But can you explain why you think that, I suppose, is a a problem or a stumbling block from a sort of a radical socialist perspective?
I think, anyone who's trying to transform society radically in the way that socialists are have to begin from an analysis of where they think the world is. What point of development the world has reached, and in Britain, where Britain's at this particular moment in its history. Now, think about the different factions in British political society. Your sort of right-wing Brexiteer thinks that this is the time of Britain's national resurgence on the world stage, right? If you're a Scottish nationalist, I'm not talking about people who support Scottish independence here, I'm talking specifically about someone who has a Scottish nationalist ideology. You think this is the time of the re-emergence of Scotland on the British stage. If you are a Corbynite, there's a very good chance, again, it's quite a broad church, but there's a very good chance that you think that this is the time of the re-emergence of social democracy, of that kind of left of centre politics upon the British stage. Really, for me, none of those things are the whole picture. What this is a period of is the decline and crisis and disintegration of the British state, and each of those movements and others are part of that picture of disintegration. So socialists have to their politics kind of have to emerge from that point. So if you take Corbynism, and my worry is that socialists who are exclusively focused on their corner, as it were, will miss the ways in which the crisis of the British state can advance their particular cause and therefore the cause of changing the whole of British society. So you take Corbynism. The Achilles heel of Corbynism is Labourism. To the extent that Corbyn's socialist politics, and I often think of Corbyn as quite distinct from the Labour tradition in quite a lot of ways. He's very much a person of the mass movements. He always was. He was always big on a very political vision of how socialist politics works, by which I mean it wasn't these just kind of stodgy arguments about stodgy, they're true but they're limited. These sorts of arguments of, workers will form into trade unions. The trade unions will take over larger and larger parts of industry. They'll have a political wing in the Labour Party, and then sort of generally through this process, the working class will take over society and socialism. Corbyn always had a much more dynamic vision of politics, which is that the left isn't just made up of kind of historic processes, it's made up of radical ruptures, mass movements, explosions of mass sentiment, and those can be attracted by issues of the oppression of women, war, racism, constitutional issues, as we've seen in the last few years. So he's always been at a slight divergence from the Labourite tradition. If Corbynism fails, it will be because once in power, for example, he'll feel the need to align himself with the strategic objectives of the British state to one extent or another, and that will curb the radicalism of his politics, because he's not just up against the PLP, he's up against the British Civil Service, he's up against the Bank of England, he's up against the British Army, and these are huge forces bearing down on someone who, it must be said, has conducted himself very well under the attacks that he has faced. But so therefore, a perspective that bears in mind that the British state can be seriously damaged by constitutional movements is one that can help Corbynism. On the other hand, the independence movement can itself benefit from the growth of left-wing politics in the UK as a whole. I mean, the Scottish independence movement cannot be the left-wing movement of the whole of British society. But if Scotland were to gain independence, we would not leave Britain, right? Even if we left under the sort of best conditions of independence, for example, we got our own currency and things like that, and had control, like full control, our major trading partner is always going to be our right next door neighbour, one of the largest economies in the world. It does not benefit people who want independence because they overwhelmingly want social justice, and that is what motivates people who want Scottish independence. If we are still entangled in a UK system, a UK economy, there's a pressure for us to compete with capital and the kind of our UK state in our economy, and as well, because the independence movement was motivated by those left-wing impulses, as you say, the SNP, frankly, from the policy proposals that are coming from Corbyn, forces like the SNP could learn a lot. There are some, by the way, ways where the SNP is still to the left of Corbynism, and it's particularly because of that state, that relationship that Labourism has to the state. So Trident is a perfect example. It's a very good reason why the SNP has a better position, which is that they are not tied to the strategic imperatives of the state. So that's a sort of example of that process in play. But the point is, socialists in these different movements are part of this dynamic situation where we can reinforce each other's movements.
You mentioned there, you were talking about the institutions of the British state, so the state apparatus, essentially. And this is an argument we do hear, I suppose, on the pro-independence left quite often, is that, I suppose, a Labour victory in an impending general election, which is something that I suppose all of us at this table, being on the left, would like to see, that wouldn't be enough to transform British society, because certain institutions are so embedded in the British establishment, and then this isn't to say there isn't a Scottish establishment, that's a whole other debate, but the British establishment is essentially in polar opposition ideologically to what the Corbyn project represents. That's a common argument that we hear. And just to pick out a wee line, I suppose, from David's article here, he noted this. You basically said no radical politics is possible without independence from the institutions of British capitalism. I suppose that's what you just said, but just to kind of sort of zero in on that. I mean, to what extent would you say, Laura, does Corbyn share that analysis? Do you think he's aware of it? And if so, I suppose, how can Labour kind of, if they're looking in it to win supporters to Corbyn's political project and the Labour political project, how can they reassure people who perhaps subscribe to that analysis?
I mean, the story that David's just told is basically the story that's in A Very British Coup, which is a fictional account of a left-wing Labour government. Yeah. So whether you read the book of A Very British Coup or watch the TV series, it ends badly for Harry Perkins, who's the left-wing Labour Prime Minister. He either goes out in a military coup or he has to resign over a disaster at a nuclear power station. But basically, the theme is that they were unable to overcome the sort of institutions within the British state that were hostile to them. And they consistently had the security services working to bring them down one way or another. I don't think it's untrue fundamentally to say that those institutions would be completely hostile to a left-wing Labour government, and it would be, from the very start, you'd experience attempts to basically bring the economy to a crashing halt, to humiliate Labour politicians, basically until the government's completely destroyed. What I think that this is missing, though, is that both Corbyn and McDonnell have been pretty clear that they don't see the sort of route to the transformation of society as being purely parliamentary. They've both been pretty open about the fact that they want to see a sort of movement of people on the streets and workplaces through their trade unions, forming the support for that government when it does face difficult times. I think they understand that there will be struggle both within the state and against the state to try and maintain that Labour government, and I think that that's shared by sort of at least the more sophisticated elements of Corbynism, who aren't just looking for sort of a government to rearrange the way societies run, but are looking for it to reform political structure and economic structures, and that provides the opportunity for extra parliamentary activists to then apply pressure from below to the institutions that we're talking about. In terms of what David said about independence from British capital institutions, I think the concern from my point of view is that the vehicle for that is a Scottish nationalism which, as it has grown sort of closer to the possibility of formal independence, has actually become sort of more weak and more willing to accept capitalism, more willing to even sort of not even mitigate the worst excesses of it, as it sort of advances support for independence. And I can't see, in an independent Scotland, why a Scottish state would be a particularly, fertile ground for then transforming society within Scotland.
Is that something you quickly would want to contend there, David? I suppose because that is something that is a very legitimate point made on the Labour left. Is that it's very well having a kind of radical analysis of what independence could be, should be, must be, but even at not just at a sort of a grassroots level, but at a genuinely effective kind of level, are these movements already in place to ensure that actually happens? Is that even possible?
You have to remember, and this is what gives me hope for both the Corbyn project and the Independence project, this is the age of mass movements. In our lifetimes have been the greatest period for the mass mobilisation of ordinary people on, for example, street protest movements ever in British history. As far as, I say ever in British history, I don't know if it would match Chartism or something, but we're going back. You'd have to go back something like that far, right? For example, think about the movements we've had. Anti-Iraq War movement, millions in the streets, right? Student movement, anti-austerity movement, the Scottish independence movement itself, huge social participation. The movements, Palestine, who would have thought British society, of all societies, would have been one of the, outside of the Middle East, perhaps certainly one of the strongest countries in support of Palestine, with marches of hundreds of thousands, right? And these are also huge social networks, campuses across the country engaged in the boycott and divestment sanctions campaign, all that kind of stuff. So a huge, I can't remember what the statistic is, something like 16% of people are engaged in extra-parliamentary politics on this sort of basis. And that's an incredibly high historic level. It's mirrored around the world, by the way, and it's to do with the collapse in support for institutions like the media, politics, the banks. It has actually pushed people into engagement. So all these you get these sort of sulky analyses of the world that are like, oh, where are all the radical struggles now and all that kind of stuff. This is an extremely explosive period in sort of extra-parliamentary democratic politics. Even the movement to get Corbyn elected the head of a political party had to be extra-parliamentary. You remember those huge rallies that were organised to defend him from being ousted as leader of a political party, right? So I think those forces are in play, and the other thing I think is in play is the dynamic of decline. So for me, it's not that there's something special about the Scottish, like a new or nascent Scottish state, right? It would take years to form that state, but I don't think that, because you do get this real nationalist thing of sort of like the Celts are sort of a left-wing people or something like that. I don't really believe in sort of national personalities like that. But I do think that context is enormously important. The fact that independence is enormously left-wing is enormously important. And it's the fact that Scotland is part of Britain it is one of the things that makes it such an interesting development. Just though and in both of those things that we're talking about, Corbynism and independence, the extra parliamentary angle would be, I'd suggest, the key angle, right? An example in Corbynism, right? Let's say Jeremy Corbyn wants to pass a radical taxation measure, something like some kind of new tax on corporations, right? What happens? In a very British coup, Parkins did at least have most of his parliamentary party on board, right? Corbyn's, well, let's see what happens with re-selection and stuff, but that's going to be a real uphill struggle, right? And I suggest that Corbyn's never going to have, it's kind of an understatement, a steady majority in the parliament. So what does he have? I would say in circumstances like that, and this is a kind of grotesque example to use, but let's remember who we're up against as well, right? In Italy now, Salvini, head of the League, is is it Vice Prime Minister, Vice President? I can't remember, but it's one of the top.
I think it's Vice President.
So it's one of the top positions in the government. They've got people in the government there. The League's thugs are walking around in the streets, beating up immigrants, beating up political opponents, all that kind of stuff. Our enemies in the kind of European arms race, the polarisation of European politics, they recognise fine well that this is the era where politics is not wholly constitutional. It's not wholly within institutions, that it's also popular, it's mass, it's extra-parliamentary. If you had a Corbyn government, you would need a very large social movement stretched across the country that said, you know what, if these corporations say we're not paying that tax, or the civil service say we're not drafting this legislation, or the Parliamentary Labour Party says we're not voting through this is demagoguery, we're going to take action against these corporations, and we're going to hurt their profits more than if that tax went through. Now, that's just one example. I don't know what's going to happen. But those are the sorts of manoeuvres you would need, and you would need them in a Scottish context as well. If you're in a situation where the state is being set up, and they're setting up a central bank, actually, under the Growth Commission's proposals, we wouldn't have a central bank, right? just to return to how ludicrous those ideas are. But if they're setting up a central bank, and it's like the one in the City of London, I say get thousands of people in there. You're not doing this, right? We're going to decide. Now, none of these things are set in stone. I don't think that you get Corbyn as Prime Minister, and I'm sure Laura doesn't believe this. You get Corbyn as Prime Minister, hey presto, we're on the march. I don't think you get a Scottish independence, and then hey presto, it turns into a more left-wing country. I think that the key ingredient there is action. And actually, in every single struggle since capitalism was born, it's been the same for working class people and for the left. The key issue is us, our ability to organise and influence events.
I mean, I suppose that is probably one of the broadest areas of agreement here is that need for that. I suppose not just foot soldiers. I suppose it's all about sort of that's just at bread and butter at what we believe as working class empowerment at the end of the day, and the importance of political education, obviously. But I suppose, I mean, before I get on, just finally, I suppose, to the areas where we do all sort of broadly agree and can move forward, I just want to sort of nail down, I suppose, just briefly the areas where we are, I suppose, yourself, Laura, and David are diverging slightly here, which I think has probably been obvious to listeners so far anyway. But I mean, could you just sort of, I suppose, just to sum up, I mean, how can the differences you and David, I suppose, be resolved? Can they be resolved? Do they even need to be resolved? Is it, from a sort of, I mean, what's your perspective?
I mean, I guess it all depends on what happens. We might get a Corbyn government, which will have an impact on people's attitude to Scottish independence, and we might have Scottish independence, which will affect the way sort of socialist Labour activists in Scotland approach their strategy. I think actually the article that David wrote for Conter didn't, completely. It actually left open the possibility for radical federalism as a sort of vehicle for advancing socialism at the same time, a sort of rebalancing power between the UK. And I think where we still disagree is that, from my point of view, over the past 5 years, we have achieved that almost complete transformation of the Labour Party. Even if we don't have the PLP, a lot of these people are sufficiently wedded to their careers that they're going to have to go with it, whether they like it or not, if we get into government. What we lack is the movement. But in Scotland, similarly, you lack that sort of coherent social movement that is united and has a shared vision. And you also lack the possibility of a governing party that is interested in creating opportunities for a social movement to sort of make change and wield power over corporations and over employers. I mean, the SNP are basically at the moment, I think, still throwing out enough kind of social democratic policies to keep people just about happy, while not being interested in sort of challenging capitalism in any serious way. And just quickly, do you think Scottish Labour, as it stands, I know obviously Scottish Labour now too does have a Corbynite leader, if you want to call it that, and obviously
you've done stuff obviously for Campaign for Socialism, and there's obviously a very clear sort of movement amongst activists in that direction as well. But do you think Scottish Labour is equipped to offer an alternative at a parliamentary level to what the SNP is offering?
Yeah, I think the direction that Richard's taken it in still needs to be consolidated, and I think the sort of party machine at some point will need to kind of reorient itself, because it's still behaving as though nothing's changed politically, when in fact quite a lot of things has changed. But I think that is starting to happen slowly, and I think if we have some more consistency on the sort of messages that Richard himself wants to put forward, I think the offer there is something radically different, as a complete break from, not socialism, but a total break at least from neoliberalism, and something far more radical than what the SNP are offering currently and will ever offer if the Growth Commission's anything to go by. And
so on that point, David, do you feel, when it comes to points of divergence here, I mean, is radical federalism, do you think that can, I mean, obviously, again, we were talking how there's various perspectives on that, but radical federalism has been put across. Do you think that's a coherent and logical alternative to independence? Do you think that forces on the radical left in Scotland, is this an issue that should be dropping down the agenda, or do you think it constantly needs to be at the forefront of discussion?
I mean, like I say, I'm sympathetic and just a bit unconvinced. It's not a proposal I'm hostile to. It's just that I don't see how it works or why it works. I think as well that there's a general kind of it's less a theory than a sort of like a style of left wing. Well, it is a theory as well, but it's a sort of how you view the process of history. I mean, I think that what the socialist left needs to be in Britain today is a movement that responds to the ruptures, the enormous ruptures that the British state is facing. I mean, we haven't even discussed Brexit. Do you know, in a way,
that's going to be a whole other day.
That's a whole other tune in next week. In a way, I think Brexit is a bigger shock to the neoliberal consensus than so far Scottish independence or Corbynism has been, because Brexit, especially if it goes, even if it went through on the lines of the Chequers Agreement, the kind of the moderate one at this stage, but especially if it was more like a kind of no deal type situation, that's a real shock to the kind of economic consensus that's governed society for all of our lives. Now, I just think that the left should respond to those ruptures, which I think are inherent in historical development, especially in a period of decline, like the British state's facing. When it comes to the independence movement, well, that's the big problem. It was well to the left, I would argue, of where it is now when there was a mass movement. The defeat of that mass movement, defeats of movements always drive working class movements in certain directions. The Labour Party itself, the modern Labour Party, was formed out of a succession of defeats. And what you usually saw was, there would be a huge kind of working class movement, very grassroots, very radical. It would face a defeat. The movement would retreat into the Labour Party, and it would take that sort of different, slightly more politically degenerated course. Now, I think the Yes movement's in a relative slump because of that defeat it faced in 2014. I still absolutely believe that another shot at independence would reintroduce that mass movement. By the way, I think the left from the independence movement 2012 to 2014 has learnt a lot of lessons from that period. But that's the context we're struggling with. And it is true as well, the independence movement faces serious strategic struggles, which we don't have time to go into here, but about the fact that the British state has gotten to a position of weakness, and this is a sign of weakness, that it doesn't want to allow another referendum. And how do you use mass movement politics to challenge that situation? So again, though, these questions ultimately come down to mass extra-parliamentary politics. I'm not quite so sanguine about the position of the Labour Party in terms of these careerists will have to go along with the left, because they're still exerting a drag. This is the other thing about the period of rupture and decline that I'm talking about, that the left has to make successes out of. They need to be astonishing successes. See if Jeremy Corbyn came to power, and let's just say he somehow worked out an agreement with his PLP and with the civil service and with all these other institutions that, you know, and I don't think he would do this because I think he's a real, I think Corbyn himself is the real deal, right? But let's just say the Labour somehow struggled through and it was sort of past 3 or 4 bits of quite significant progressive legislation, slight increase in taxes, slight increase in, you know, significant but, you know, increase in spending, the way New Labour did. You know, people forget, New Labour did actually spend quite a lot more money on public services than the Tories did.
Yeah, sure.
See if it did those things and it was kind of, if it were even possible to have a middle-of-the-road social democratic success, that would not be enough for this period. Over the last 10 years, the working class has lost a lot of money. A lot of money, right? We never got the money back from bailing out the banks. Wages have fallen for 10 years plus, stagnant for God knows 10 years, you know, before that. The situation's a dangerous one, right? You know, the Tommy Robinson lot look like a joke right now. If Labour's not an astonishing, if Corbyn were to come to power and not make a ruptural, astonishing success of that situation, the right would be in a much stronger position to say they're still all the same. The left is not in opposition to the status quo. They're all cut from the same cloth. And both in the case of Corbynism and in the case of Scottish independence, and of course in the case of Brexit, if the left does not make that effective intervention, and it's seen changing in a very big way, we open ourselves up to that really, you know, very real danger.
So just finally then, just ask yourself, Dave, and then I'll give sort of Laura the final word on this. I mean, bearing all that in mind, more positively, what are the areas of agreement here that we should really be working together on, whether we're sort of on the pro-independence left, the Labour left, the non-affiliated left? If we genuinely are serious about supporting a project that can mobilise people across the country without sacrificing, I suppose, the sort of unique perspectives we hold on the Constitution and the rest of it. Well, what are the areas that, regardless, we just absolutely, as a necessity, need to be working together?
So, and I agree with you. I mean, it's slightly unrealistic to imagine that there are these divergent forces with divergent strategic outlooks and that they can just melt them all down, right? I mean, the divisions that exist in the socialist movement, the meaningless ones should be avoided. The meaningful ones should be explored, right? Like we are tonight. Not all divisions are bad things. Sometimes they are based on very real differences. Take, for example, the Growth Commission in Scotland, right? There should be a cross-party, non-party response to that attack, right? I mean, see that idea about the currency. The fact that that can be floated in normal political conversation 10 years after the financial crisis, with the intervening Eurozone crisis that we've had, right? I don't think that's good that you can get away talking about that in polite society, privatising the money supply, ending a situation where you have monetary policy. I know it's the most bizarre kind of neoliberal Hayekian policy I've ever had. But also, even if it's not accepted wholesale, and that currency proposal is, to be fair to the SNP left and to the wider independence movement left, under serious pressure now from the left. Even if it's not adopted wholesale, there's a lot of ideas that have slipped through. So that's a perfect example of an area where you can have, and that's sort of pressure that's bearing down on Labour as well. You know, Jackie Baillie spoke at the launch of the policy sans the currency thing. So that's a clear area of unity. I think as well, we just have to have each other's backs when it comes to the stuff I'm talking about, like when the left is under attack from the state. And I don't think it'll just be Corbynism who's under attack. The fact that Jeremy Corbyn has said, and he's flip-flopped on this, but he said, right to national self-determination, if Scottish people want another referendum, then they should be allowed another referendum. That's an area of unity, as I see it. We can't allow the state to put itself in a position where it is the decider of democratic questions. I'd say the same thing about Brexit. I think we should resist this idea of like a second vote. I not for all kinds of reasons, but one is that the left should not ever argue to empower the state to deny the vote. I have all kinds of criticisms of referendums as a thing, right? But we would be empowering the state to rob working class people of their say. So I think there are clear areas where there's common economic fronts, there's common fronts of, you know, democratic rights and the defence of democratic rights for working class people and the left. And then just finally, there's all kinds of common movements that we should be pushing hard, like living rent, we've both talked about tonight, right? I mean, we're talking on a level of kind of like theory and strategy and politics and stuff. See, unless there's guts in that movement, unless there's organisation, you know, mass organisation of working class people, we're in serious trouble. I mean, we're talking like all of these fronts were kind of pushing ahead in a way. It could really go either way at this point. The crisis of the British state is also building up the forces of the right, quite clearly. And so we're not going to have anything to draw on unless we can rebuild industrial collectivism. We can rebuild community collectivism. We can rebuild, there's mass working class democracy in all areas of life.
I suppose just finally then, Laura, I mean, to what extent would you sort of agree with that analysis? Where do we have common course here as a movement, if we want to call ourselves that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that David and I both basically want to live in the same kind of society, and the disagreement is actually how we achieve that, and you know what the best kind of landscape is for socialists to get to that point. I think this already happens. You know, Labour activists and pro-independence activists, SNP activists are already working together in their trade unions in Living Rent and Better Than Zero. There already is that cooperation. What really needs to happen is to take those trade unions into the really under-unionised sectors that have basically been ignored, to kind of try and pull the British or Scottish trade union movement
nicely done.
Yeah, out of the doldrums, because that's where it is, and it's where it's been for a long time. And you know, it will carry on in the sectors that it's in, but expansion in that has been really, really slow to happen. And I think we need a concerted effort to push that, because we need to build a sort of labour movement that will be capable of wielding power and sustaining as a left-wing Labour government, or alternatively providing an opposition in a sort of popular front against a Scotland where we might see sort of a more empowered Scottish Conservative Party, which is, you know, a really scary prospect for all of us. I think that both the pro-independence left and the Labour left are kind of broadly internationalist, and I think that there's a struggle for both of us to fully commit the Labour Party to anti-Trident and anti-NATO, and to stop the SNP from letting that part of their politics slide, because I think the kind of rhetoric that we've seen, and I did mention this in my piece that you talked about, the kind of anti-NATO, anti-nuclear rhetoric that we used to, you know, hear very strongly from the SNP, and was a big part of the Yes campaign, has started to slide, and you do, you know, you start to hear SNP politicians speak as if they'd like to be at the Pentagon or something, which is really scary and not encouraging for, you know, an independent Scotland. And I think we need to move the rhetoric away from nukes out of Scotland to nukes out altogether, because I think that's a big limitation of some of the pro-independence pacifist rhetoric.
I mean, obviously there is sort of groups that obviously exist within the SNP now as well, sort of Neutral Scotland, Autonomy.
Yes, that's right, that's encouraging.
There's groups that I suppose for a long time, I mean, obviously there was SNP Socialists for a while. I'm not really sure what the position of they're in just now. But I mean, you know, there does seem to obviously be on every front, and I suppose this is a positive way we can leave this, is that on every front there are movements and on a grassroots level of people, activists concerned about the direction of their party and of the overall movement, and who want to steer it in a certain way. and are resisting a top-down management of any of these things. I suppose we can gain encouragement from that, in that whatever sort of way we align ourselves, that's a spirit that's clearly not missing in Scotland. And I think we probably established that. We've probably gone slightly over, but thank you so much, David and Laura, for coming in and speaking to us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
I hope that wasn't too rusty. This was the first, obviously, ConterCast debate that we've held. So, I mean, if there's any feedback you guys have, please do email me in. As I said earlier, it's editor@conter.co.uk, or, you know, shout. You can shout Sonny Govern on Twitter as well. Basically, I mean, this is something we want to become a more regular thing in the long run. We should specify, obviously, this is for the website of Conter in association with Sonny Govern. So we don't profess to be searching for sort of balance and looking for conservatives on the other side of it, because, as you've probably heard for the last hour or so, our alignment politically is pretty clear. But nonetheless, whether it's political or sort of more technical, any sort of feedback you want to give us, we're all learning as we go, and obviously we at Conter are huge supporters of Sonny Govern and the amazing work they do, and we're very grateful to Steggy and the rest of the team for having us on. I think that's everything for now, guys. Is there anything you want to quickly say to sign off?
No, just thanks very much for having us on. I think it's been a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having us too. I think I just want to, finish off by saying that regardless of which side of this discussion we're on, at the end of the day, there is a common sort of enemy for all of us on the left, and there's going to be times in the near future, as we're seeing kind of the rise of fascism here and across Europe, that we're going to have to put aside these differences, and I hope these kind of discussions are a step towards doing that.